The chandeliers didn't just glow, they blazed. Chrysolite poured over marble floors, polished so perfectly they reflected the powerful men who walked across them. Senators, donors, media figures, the kind of people who shake hands in public and rewrite narratives in private. Cameras flashed like fireworks, documenting what they were already calling the wedding of the year. At the center of it all stood the groom, impeccably tailored tuxedo, measured smile, the posture of a man who believed he had climbed history itself and planted his flag at the top. To the crowd, he was self-made, resilient, visionary, the immigrant success story polished for prime time. They applauded his rise, without ever asking who held the ladder steady while he climbed that. He lifted his glass, soaking in the admiration. But beneath the applause lived something colder. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a performance, and every performance needs an audience. Weeks earlier, he had signed the final guest list himself, one name circled in deliberate ink, one name that made his assistant hesitate before speaking. "Are you sure?" He had smiled then, the same thin smile he wore now. "Oh, I'm sure." The invitation had not been about closure, not about maturity, not about forgiveness. It was about humiliation, because before the wealth, before the investors, before the headlines, there had been her. She was there when the apartment heat failed in winter, when rejection letters stacked higher than hope, when his accent was mocked in boardrooms and doors were politely shut in his face. She translated contracts when his confidence faltered. She worked double shifts to keep the lights on while he rehearsed pitches that no one wanted to hear. She believed in him before belief was profitable, and the moment success arrived, he rewrote the story. Suddenly he had built it alone. Suddenly, she was too emotional, too traditional, not aligned with the image. The divorce announcement had been brief, strategic, sanitized. He ascended, she had disappeared at least. That's what everyone thought. Now, as the string quartet softened into a romantic crescendo, he adjusted his cufflinks and glanced toward the entrance of the grand hall, a subtle look, almost casual, that he had calculated this moment. She would walk in alone, no designer label, no political escort, just a reminder of who she used to be, the woman he outgrew, the proof of his upgrade standing. Beside him in white silk and diamonds, the guests would whisper, they would compare, and without saying a single cruel word, he would win. But as the minutes passed, something unsettled him. The doors remained closed. The ceremony was about to begin. The bride, radiant and carefully curated, squeezed his arm. "Is everything okay?" "Perfect," he said smoothly. Yet his eyes drifted again, because humiliation requires a witness. And what if she didn't come? What if she refused to play the role he had written for her? A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Not because he missed her, but because he needed her there. Needed a contrast. We needed the audience to see how far above her he had risen. The officiant cleared his throat. Guests turned forward. Phones lifted to capture the vows. The music shifted, and just as the first words of the ceremony began to echo across the marble hall, the doors opened, slowly, not timidly, but deliberately. Every head turned and someone unexpected stepped inside. Before the tuxedos, before the champagne towers, before powerful men lined up to shake his hand and call him visionary, there was a cramped apartment with peeling paint and overdue notices stacked like quiet accusations on the kitchen counter. That was where she loved him. Back when his suit was borrowed. Back when his accent made investors tilt their heads and smile politely before declining. Back when ambition was the only expensive thing he owned. He used to come home defeated, tie loosened, eyes heavy with humiliation. The world had a way of reminding immigrants exactly where it thought they belonged. In the margins, in the waiting rooms, in the polite rejections that never said the quiet part out loud. She never flinched. When his bank account hit zero, she covered rent. When creditors called, she answered calmly in negotiated time. When his first business idea sounded impossible, she emptied her savings without hesitation. "Bet on yourself," she told him. But she was the one placing the bet. She introduced him to community leaders who saw potential instead of risk. She brought him into rooms filled with grassroots organizers, policy advocates, people who understood that power isn't inherited, it's built through relationships, through trust, through credibility. He learned quickly. He absorbed their language, their networks, their influence. And when the first breakthrough came, a contract, a grant, a partnership, he stood on stage alone to accept it. She clapped from the back. As success multiplied, so did his appetite. Not just for wealth, but for reinvention. His story became cleaner every time he told it. More heroic, more solitary. "I built this from nothing," he would say into microphones. Nothing. The word erased her. Investors admired his grit. Media outlets praised his resilience. Political figures invited him into inner circles where influence moved quietly but decisively. He studied them carefully, how they shaped perception, how they neutralized critics, how they rewrote inconvenient truths. Soon, whispers about their marriage began circulating. "She's too emotional. She doesn't understand the pressure he's under. She's holding him back. The source of the whispers was always unclear, but they echoed with his tone. When the divorce became public, he framed it as growth. "We've grown apart," he said in a statement, polished by professionals. Behind closed doors, he was colder. "You're dead weight," he told her once. Not loudly, not angrily, just clinically. "You don't fit the future I'm building." Dead weight, the same woman who carried him when the world dismissed him. Society believed him, because society prefers clean narratives. The ambitious man outgrows the past. The emotional wife can't keep up. The powerful always curate sympathy. Better than the quiet he flourished. New house, new circles, new partner whose presence matched his upgraded image. Cameras loved them, so did donors. Her. She vanished from public view. No interviews, no counter-statements, no messy social media battles. She did not defend herself in comment sections or leak private messages to tabloids. Silence. To the outside world, it looked like defeat, but silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. While he invested in visibility, she invested in substance. While he cultivated applause, she cultivated leverage. She studied markets instead of headlines. She built partnerships that didn't require cameras. She learned the architecture of power, the contracts, the shares, the quiet acquisitions that shape outcomes, long before speeches are made. And she never once corrected the narrative because correction would have kept her trapped inside his story. So she wrote her own. Back in the grand hall, the present rushed in like a held breath. Finally release. The doors remained open. Guests twisted in their seats, whispering behind manicured hands. Did she actually come? He followed their gaze but kept his posture relaxed, composed, untouchable. A slow smirk curved across his face. "She wouldn't dare," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the best man to hear. To him, she was still the woman who once waited by the phone for investors to call, still the partner who deferred, who sacrificed, who believed. He thought he knew her limits. The room quieted, and then, cutting through the marble silence like a deliberate declaration, heels echoed across the floor. The sound of her heels was not hurried, not hesitant. Each step landed with the quiet authority of someone who no longer asks for permission to exist in a room. The hall stilled. Conversations collapsed mid-sentence. Glasses hovered in the air. Even the string quartet faltered before scrambling to recover the melody. As she stepped fully into the light, not broken, not ashamed, not diminished. Her presence did not beg for attention, it commanded it. Tailored elegance, controlled composure, eyes steady, not scanning for approval but assessing the room as if she belonged there, because she did, and she was not alone. 2 bodyguards followed half a step behind her, not theatrical, not aggressive, just professional alert. The kind of security is reserved for people whose time and influence are considered valuable. A ripple of confusion passed through the guests. Bodyguards. For her. The groom's smirk stiffened, but did not disappear. Not yet. He straightened his shoulders, convincing himself this was still manageable, still salvageable. Perhaps she had found someone modestly successful. Perhaps this was an attempt to save face. Then the doors opened wider. And the second shock entered the room. A man whose name traveled across continents before he ever did. A billionaire investor whose portfolio shaped industries. A strategist known for turning struggling enterprises into global forces. His face had graced financial covers. His speeches moved markets. He walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. Beside, the temperature in the hall seemed to drop. Recognition spread in waves. That's him. It can't be. What is he doing here? The bride's smile flickered. Investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Political figures who had once dismissed her leaned forward, recalculating. The groom's expression finally cracked just slightly. The tycoon greeted a few familiar faces with polite nods before his attention settled calmly on the man at the altar. But he did not approach yet. He stayed beside her. Whispers ignited like dry grass catching flame. How does she know him? When did this happen? What did we miss? What they missed was everything that happens outside the spotlight. While he curated optics, she studied infrastructure. While he hosted galas, she attended strategy sessions. While he obsessed over image, she learned the mechanics of equity, acquisitions, long-term positioning. She invested in industries no one thought to watch. Renewable energy, community tech incubators, cross-border logistics firms rooted in immigrant entrepreneurship. She built quietly. She founded a non-profit that funded for founders locked out of traditional capital. She pondered internationally, forging alliances across markets he didn't even track. She sat at tables where decisions were made before headlines were written, and she never once corrected him publicly, never defended herself in interviews, never retaliated because public defense would have kept her reacting instead. She was building. The tycoon had noticed her long before tonight, not because of scandal, not because of gossip, but because her numbers spoke, because her investments were disciplined, because her vision was not about spectacle but sustainability. They met over policy reform discussions, over impact funding, over shared frustration at how power structures exclude those who don't perform dominance loudly enough. He respected competence. She respected leverage. Their partnership was inevitable. Back in the hall, the shift became visible. Guests who once pitied her now watched with fascination. The same people who accepted his version of history were silently questioning it. The groom stepped forward, forcing a laugh. What he said, voice tight but controlled. "This is unexpected." She met his gaze without hostility. "Is it?" she asked softly. There was no bitterness in her tone, no tremor, just certainty. The power dynamic was changing in real time. He had invited her here to contrast her past against his present, to stage a comparison that elevated him. Instead, the comparison exposed him, and the bride glanced between them, sensing the undercurrent she didn't understand. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly. The cameras, once fixed on romance, now pivoted subtly toward tension, because something more compelling than vows was unfolding. He tried to recover. "The room we're about to begin," he said lightly, as if dismissing the disruption. But the room was no longer his. Attention gravitated toward her, toward the man standing beside her, toward the unspoken realization that influence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it walks in quietly and rearranges. The heir. The tycoon finally stepped forward, not dramatically, not confrontationally, just decisively. He extended his hand. The groom hesitated before taking it. The handshake was brief, measured, and then the tycoon leaned slightly closer, voice low enough that only a few near the altar could hear. "We need to discuss something," he said calmly. "A pause about your company." The groom's jaw tightened, because for the first time that evening, for the first time in years, he did not control the narrative. The words did not echo, but they detonated. "We need to discuss something about your company." The groom's grip tightened, a fraction too long for a polite handshake. He forced a smile for the cameras, but his eyes searched the tycoon's face for a hint of bluff. There was none. "What about it?" he replied lightly, though the pitch of his voice had shifted just enough to betray him. The tycoon straightened, speaking now at a volume carefully calibrated so those closest could hear. "Investors, political donors, the kind of guests who understand financial subtext better than romance. My firm finalized an acquisition last quarter," he said, controlling shares in Meridian Holdings. A few heads snapped up immediately. Meridian Holdings, not a flashy company, not a brand splashed across billboards, but insiders knew. Meridian held structured debt across multiple emerging enterprises, quietly, strategically, including his. The groom blinked once. Meridian was the backbone beneath his empire, the invisible lender that extended credit when expansion outpaced liquidity, the firm that refinanced his riskier ventures. The safety net he assumed was stable. "We've restructured several portfolios since then," the tycoon continued calmly. "Yours included." Silence rippled outward like a shockwave. He hadn't known, because he had been busy curating headlines, busy staging this spectacle, busy proving dominance, over-leveraged, aggressively expanded, confident that access to capital would always bend in his favor. But capital has loyalties only to leverage. A murmur spread among the financial guests. Phones discreetly lit up beneath tables as messages were sent, confirmations sought. Within seconds a reality crystallized. Control had shifted. The groom's face changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but the arrogance drained from his expression, replaced by something far more human. Calculation. Double quotes. "How interesting," he said, attempting a laugh. "Congratulations on the acquisition." The tycoon nodded once. "There's more," he added. And then, almost casually, he gestured toward her. "She accepted a position on our advisory board last month." The room inhaled. The bride's bouquet trembled slightly in her grip. Politicians, who once praised the groom's self-made mythology, exchanged sharp glances. Investors who had backed him out of admiration now re-evaluated risk. Power, after all, is never emotional. It is directional, and the direction had changed. He looked at her fully. Now, not as an afterthought, not as an inconvenience, but as a variable he had failed to calculate. "He said, the word sharper than intended. "Advisory board." She held his gaze, steady and unflinching. Yes, there was no triumph in her voice, no vindication. Just truth. He attempted to recover dominance the only way he knew how, through belittlement. "So this is what this is." He said. "He showed up with investors to make a point, to play power games at my wedding." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The accusation hung in the air, an attempt to frame her as petty, emotional, reactive, the old narrative. But she did not take the bait. She did not raise her voice, did not expose private wounds, did not list sacrifices or recount the nights she kept the lights on. Instead, she spoke calmly, her words cutting deeper because they were restrained. You invited me here to prove I was nothing without you. The hall went still. Even the string quartet stopped pretending to play. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in her composure halted him. She continued, "But I was never behind you." A pause. "I was building beside you." The sentence did not accuse. It illuminated. For a moment, time fractured. Guests remembered old photos where she stood just outside the frame, old interviews where he spoke in singular pronouns, old fundraisers she organized before he was considered valuable enough to attend. The mythology unraveled quietly. He had not risen alone, he had simply claimed the credit, and while he chased applause, she learned architecture, the kind that underpins industries, kind that decides which companies expand and which collapse, the kind that doesn't need a spotlight because it controls the wiring above it. His empire, polished and photogenic, suddenly looked fragile, dependent, negotiable. He felt it. The panic crept in at the edges, not because of embarrassment but because of exposure, because the people in this room did not fear scandal, they feared instability. He turned to the tycoon again, lowering his voice. "This isn't the time." The tycoon's expression remained neutral. "Timing," he replied softly, "is everything." The priest cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim control of the ceremony. "Shall we proceed?" he asked hesitantly. The bride squeezed the groom's arm again, whispering something urgent, but his attention had drifted. Numbers ran through his mind, debt ratios, share percentages, vulnerabilities he had assumed were protected. He lifted his book. "Do you take this woman?" The question hung, suspended in the air, but the groom wasn't listening anymore. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. "Do you take this woman?" But the words felt secondary, now, hollow, procedural, the kind of ritual people perform when the real story has already unfolded somewhere else. The guests were no longer watching the bride. They were watching the balance of power recalibrate in real time. Investors leaned toward one another in quiet calculation. Political figures who once praised his unstoppable rise now studied him with cooler eyes, not hostile, just cautious. The way power studies risk. The bride sensed it too. Her smile faltered, not because she understood the financial intricacies, but because she could feel the shift. The room no longer revolved around romance. It revolved around leverage. He stood at the altar, distracted, mind racing through contingencies instead of vows. For the first time in years, he was not performing dominance. He was assessing survival, and she did nothing dramatic. No final speech, no public humiliation, no victorious smirk. She simply allowed the truth to breathe. That was enough. The tycoon gave a subtle nod, signaling that the message had been delivered. No threats, no ultimatums, just information, the most powerful currency in any room. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the hall one last time, not searching for validation, not savoring revenge, just witnessing the moment for what it was. Closure. Not because he lost, but because she no longer needed him to. Without another word, she pivoted toward the exit. The bodyguards fell into step behind her, quiet and unobtrusive. The crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear but respect. Every step she took away from the altar felt heavier than any argument she could have made, because she did not stay to prove a point. She had already proven it. Outside, the air was cool and charged with anticipation. News cameras lined the entrance, originally positioned to capture a glittering arrival of elites and influencers. They had expected romance, spectacle, pageantry. Instead, they caught transformation. As she emerged, flashes ignited in rapid succession. Not because of scandal, because of status, as reporters called her name now. Not as a footnote to his, but independently. Questions shifted. Narratives rewrote themselves mid-broadcast. Is it true about the acquisition? How will this affect the market? What does this mean for emerging founders? She paused briefly, offering no dramatic statement, just a composed expression that said everything. Words could not. She was no longer the ex-wife. She was founder, investor, board member, philanthropist, architect of her own leverage. The car door opened. She entered without haste. The tycoon followed. On the opposite side, conversation already moving toward strategy rather than spectacle. Inside the hall, the ceremony resumed awkwardly. Applause sounded thinner, forced. The illusion had cracked, because power, once exposed as fragile, is never viewed the same again. He had invited her to shrink her instead. He revealed himself. True power isn't loud. It doesn't beg for attention or scream for validation. It steadies, it waits. It builds in silence until the moment arrives, and then it speaks only once, and when it does, the room rearranges itself around it. He thought the wedding was his victory parade, but it became the unveiling of the woman he underestimated.